It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood.
Welcome to Boone and Crockett's Heritage of the Hunt.
Hey, I've got Jon Gassett and Kristie Blevins here today. We are in Washington, D.C. We just did a rollout of the Boone and Crockett Club's Poach and Pay Report. And you, Jon and Kristie, are the researchers that did all this. So let's go back a little bit here for the Heritage of the Hunt podcast and describe how Poach and Pay concept with the Boone and Crockett Club started. It was probably 6-8 years ago where the first research came out, right?
Yeah, about that. 2017, Boone and Crockett had a study done that looked at replacement cost and whether penalties were adequate across the 50 states. About that same time, Kristie was doing some research in Kentucky on the levels of crime and the losses of conservation dollars due to penalties and fines not getting assessed properly. So when we talked with Tony at Boone and Crockett, we put those two ideas together and came up with the next step of Poach and Pay, and that's how do we do this, a study on a more comprehensive level.
So we've always known poaching is a pretty big issue, a pretty serious issue, but we were able to really document the detection rate, some of the conservation costs. And so that was a big part of what we were trying to accomplish with this research, wasn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And tell me, as a criminologist, Kristie, why are those points important? Why is the detection rate and conservation, why would those things be relevant in helping us to address the poaching issue in the country?
I think because a lot of people don't report poaching events, when they know they occur, because they don't consider it to be very serious. So they think, well, they put a deer in the freezer, who cares? But what it is theft of a public resource. So we need for people to know that, hey, this is serious. We're not detecting a lot of it. We need to know about it. So we need to get people to report it. And I think part of educating people about that is showing the true cost.
Absolutely. So we started this project right before COVID hit, right? I mean, we got a funding. We had sponsors, Safari Club International, Loophole, Boone and Crockett Club, obviously, Wildlife Management Institute, Bass Pro and Cabela's Outdoor Fund. We've had a lot of sponsors who pitched in to help. We also got a multi-state conservation grant through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because this was a big survey. It entailed fairly substantial interviews with landowners, hunters, and conservation law enforcement officers. So you guys, the first part of it was that survey work. Tell me about how we got that started. What was the reasoning and what was the methodology?
Well, so we tried to pick 8 states across the country that were representative states. We based that on how large they were, their population density of humans, how many big game species they had, and what percentage of public versus private, their lands were in public versus private ownership. And the idea was to get kind of a representative sample across the country. Then we sent survey instruments, and these were not small ones. These were 30 to 40 questions. So on average took about an hour and a half to complete, to 80,000 landowners, 80,000 licensed hunters, and then about 4,000 conservation officers in those 8 states. So very large samples.
That was huge sample size. And the interview questions, or the questions, the survey instrument that you sent was, as you said, very comprehensive. We were trying to understand their own personal experience potentially on their land, or what they had seen themselves. What were some of the types of questions we were asking in that?
So we were looking at a couple of things. One is how their concerns varied geographically. In other words, are you more worried about poaching on your own property or at the state where you live, at the state level where you live? What about land you own or hunt on in other states other than your state of residence? And then what about the national level, the U.S. level, and looked at their concern across those geographic levels. We also looked at biological factors and social factors. Do you think it's impacting populations? Do you think it's impacting access, ability to get on property, especially private property, to hunt? Do you think does it impact your personal opinion of hunting, knowing that these acts are going on? And most importantly, do you think it impacts the public's opinion of hunters?
Well, and that's kind of a key issue. That was one of the big things that the Boone and Crockett Club was interested in with the Poach and Pay project in the first place, was hunters
Or not poachers.
are not poachers. This is not synonymous. This is not the same thing. And yet the media and some of the public can conflate that concept, or they'll use these hunters killed if they poached it, they're poachers. It's different. And we wanted to be able to differentiate that. The other part was trying to differentiate or acknowledge or recognize that poaching is not a victimless crime, that the public, because wildlife is a public resource, the public is losing an asset, if you will, and obviously the conservation agencies that are managing wildlife are. So those were all aspects we were trying to kind of dig into a little bit, and that survey instrument started that process and came up with a whole bunch of data. I know initially the intention was to do interviews. You wanted to talk to and do face-to-face interviews. And Kristie, tell us a little bit from your background as a criminologist why that's relevant and what the intention was going to be.
Well, we wanted to talk to people who have poached, whether or not they've been convicted. We wanted to speak to both sides to see, why were you doing it? We wanted to find out more about their motivations. And we did have a few that decided to speak with us in depth. But the ones that we talked to, it was over the phone. Hopefully, we'll be able to do some face-to-face interviews in the future. But it's all about getting to their motivation, their mindset, and if they weren't caught, maybe the techniques that they use versus the ones that were caught and the techniques that they used.
And I know some of that was hindered because of COVID, because initially some of that research was going to go from the survey that we did and immediately into those face-to-face interviews. And obviously we couldn't do that for a while.
Another factor there too, that we, it's just one of the vagaries of research is she had done studies like this prior with like convicted burglars and other people who have been convicted of crimes. The part we missed was they're incarcerated. And for a candy bar or a bag of pretzels, they'll talk to you all day.
Right.
Poachers aren't incarcerated, so trying to get them even with incentives of gift cards. We got up as high as a $100 gift card for a confidential survey on the phone, and we still weren't getting buyers because they still think something's up. We're going to catch them.
Well, and we talked about that it was confidential and we were trying to do this, and obviously, hey, it wasn't about bribing a poacher to tell us their story, but at the same time, we needed that information to come up with that detection rate. So you shifted to, or you were probably going to use this as well, but it expanded a use of something called a Bayesian statistical model, which is not a new, but it's a statistical concept where you're bringing in a wide variety of data sets, your survey, the interviews with poachers, but you also used things like radio telemetry. So, rates of animals with a radio tracking collar that were poached, and a whole bunch of other data. Some of the other things that you included in that survey, pretty substantial, right?
Yeah, they were. And that's the great thing about Bayesian. And it is actually an old statistical technique. And here I am, the biologist, talking out of school with the statistics professor here. But, it was an old statistical technique that fell out of favor because it didn't have the level of precision or to produce the level of precision that modern researchers wanted. But it's come back into vogue now for things like imperiled species, things where you have incredibly small data sets where normal statistics don't work. Bayesian does allow you to work with those data sets. And and once again, I'm a wildlife biologist, not a statistician, but my understanding is, you come up with an estimate. We think it's about this, and you seed the model with that, and you feed it bits of independent data that might relate to that, and it refines that estimate. It'll move it back and forth till it gets you a better and better number. So we used everything from citation rates to the number of officers and the density of officers in the state. So how much land each one had to cover. We used the telemetry research, and there were 28 studies we found where they actually had poaching mortality associated with those big game species under telemetry. And that's really an independent verification because it's a known population that wasn't testing poaching. That's the poaching measure was an artifact, but for us it was spot on for what we needed. It tells us, hey, this percent was legally taken, this percent was illegally taken. On that ratio you can feed into the model and it'll help refine it.
And the more information you can feed it is relevant. And I think one of the other things, if I remember, is crime rates for other, to use the NCVS. Can you explain a little bit what that is and why that was relevant in this comparison?
Yes, the National Crime Victimization Survey is a fairly funded study that's done to look at real rates of crimes, to detect the dark figure. That is, has this happened to you? This is a sample of households throughout the country. And so, has this happened to you, and did you report it? And, if not, why? And we see that a lot of even violent crimes aren't reported about half of the time. And nonviolent crimes aren't reported, 70% of the time in some cases. So we know that there is a large dark figure of crime that these crimes are not known to authorities, so they're not reported in crime statistics. And we thought, well, with victimless crimes where you can't speak to a victim, like, something like gambling, some people say prostitution is victimless, and drug use. So we know that it's hard to determine those types of dark figures. So we thought about, what about poaching? Even though it is not a victimless crime, there's no victim per se to speak to.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, deer don't talk.
Yeah.
Especially the dead ones. And so we use the NCVS figure for larceny, which is, basically someone that steals something outside of your presence, where they didn't enter your house or your home, which we said, okay, that's stealing from your property. So poaching is stealing from, in many cases, public or private property, but there's, it's outside. You're not endangering somebody's life usually. So like an armed robbery would be. And that number's around 25%. So we actually ran two Bayesian models. One was a conservative model where we seeded it with 5% is always our estimate to start with. And then we use the 25 as the liberal model. And we let those converge and took an average of both. So that's how we ended up with our number.
Okay, well, and that number, and we during our press conference, it was a drum roll there. We're coming in at about 4%. Is all we're detecting. So that's saying only about 4% of poaching crimes are being detected in the country. And that's a regular rate. We've also then took that to create the dark figure, which is then the amount that is not. And so given the fact that you still have a range, a confidence interval, we took a conservative approach and said, okay, we're going to go for a detection rate of 5% and a dark figure then of 95%. So 95% poaching is not detected, and that's problematic. From there, we then said, okay, so how much does this cost conservation agencies? If you were to think about the fines and the restitution or the replacement values of those animals, how much are agencies losing by that 95% that's not being caught? And so tell me how you developed that model and came up with, because some states charge a lot for replacement, right? Like Nevada has, if you poached and are convicted of poaching an elk or a moose, it's $30,000. Other states don't have replacement costs at all.
Correct.
And we had the full gamut with ours. For our sample states, we had one that had no replacement cost, and Nevada was the other one, $30,000.
So you took the minimum estimate then, right? Yes. For what, again, because we're trying to be conservative here, want to make sure that we're not overstating something. So minimum fines, minimum replacement costs, 95% detection rate, and our
95% undetected.
I'm sorry, 95% undetected.
Yes.
Yes, the dark figure I meant. 95% dark figure.
Now, to strengthen that a little more, instead of just using the 8 states replacement cost, because that was sort of a weak spot, considering we only had 7. If you take the one state that has none, what we did before we did that math to figure out what the loss was, is we took every state that had replacement cost by species, and we came up with a number per species. We used that number. So now you're averaging basically 50 states minus the few that don't have replacement costs. It gives you a lot more solid number to work with.
Okay, so it's pretty defensible now.
Yes.
And we're talking fines and restitution combined almost $1.4 billion.
Correct.
Minimum, at a minimum.
Minimum.
And now that's if all the illegal cases, if we quantify those as to what the value of the animal was and what the minimum penalty is, that's what that number is. So we do know we catch some.
Right.
So that brings us down a little bit, but because it's less than 5%, it's not very much.
Right. Yeah. And obviously we're never going to catch all of them.
Sure.
But it is still a pretty substantial number, particularly when you consider that the amount that state fish and wildlife agencies get through the Pittman-Robertson Federal Wildlife Federal Aid Program, there is $1 billion.
That gives us $1 billion combined between on the wildlife and fish side. So it's even bigger than, it's not just the wildlife side. Wildlife and fish combined is about $1 billion a year. And in the, on the licensing side, people buy about $1 billion worth of hunting and fishing licenses and permits a year. So for all the states, it's the equivalent of every license that's sold in every state.
Pretty substantial conservation costs. So even if we then were able to improve or reduce that dark figure by a certain amount, we're making a difference here, and agencies would recognize, particularly if those fines and restitution are specifically targeted back to those agencies to be able to continue their anti-poaching techniques. It will probably again reduce that detection level and increase the opportunity to capture poachers and make sure that we're not losing these wildlife and not we're addressing the victims in this situation of the non-victim crime, right?
And we are some of the victims.
We are the victims.
Yeah. The public, yes.
Yeah. So it's pretty fascinating stuff, and it's pretty scary. It's a little overwhelming.
And to talk about it a little bit more about replacement costs versus fines, because most agencies, as you might expect, fines aren't necessarily tied to an agency. In other words, you don't necessarily want state police or the sheriff's office getting the money from all the tickets they write. It would just encourage them to write more tickets to build their budget.
Yeah, fair.
Replacement costs, though, almost universally are remanded back to the agencies, with the exception of one state, and that's one of our treatment states, believe it or not, Missouri.
Okay.
But they get an 8% sales tax. So the way they got replacement costs was they agreed to give those to the school systems.
Okay.
So the school system in Missouri takes the replacement cost money, because Missouri gets way more than that in the sales tax.
Right.
So
Gotcha.
other than that, replacement costs go to the agency. Fines and penalties usually go into the general treasury, just to keep from incentivizing, ticket quotas, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the other aspects of the survey was talking to prosecutors, because there was a question about whether or not they're taking poaching seriously and some of the challenges they face, or whether they see, do they think that it's as big of an issue as we do? Do they recognize this? What did you learn from some of the conversations or the interviews that you had with the prosecutors?
Well, they all said that they do believe that it is important to prosecute these crimes. And they also said that hey, I would like to know more about it. I was frankly surprised at the number of prosecutors that said, I would really like to know more about this so that I could do it more efficiently, more effectively. So I think for our purposes, educating prosecutors would be very, very helpful. They also said that witness testimony was important. And not only witnesses, maybe a landowner that observed it happen, but from the officer as well, who is building the case. So it's important that we educate officers on how to build a good case to present it to the prosecutor as well.
And there's probably some sampling bias here, but it was interesting to us. We did ask some basic demographic questions. And I'm working from memory here, but close to 60% of the prosecutors that responded personally hunt.
Interesting.
And I think it's close to 80% that if they didn't, one of their immediate family members did. So even people who are close to that culture still are not very familiar with the legal, the problems associated with the legal and conservation costs around it. So, but you got to imagine, prosecutors are dealing with every crime known in that state. So trying to figure out what this one little section is over here, exactly. But I was happy to see that at least the ones that responded, they're hunters.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So one of the other things that we talked about in detail in that report, in the Poach and Pay report, is the typologies of what types, what are their motivations? And with that was, what are the most likely things that would deter them from poaching in the future? Give me a little bit of an overview of what some of those typologies are, and how that affects both what officers are seeing in the field, as well as how we might be able to then move to address some of those motivations.
Well, trophy poachers, that's a very important type of poacher to discuss, because when we talked with the conservation officers, they believe that that type of poaching occurs more often than others. That's, where people are going after the biggest, the best animal that they can find, for the trophy. And their motivation is to, ego and have this animal to show it off. So, that is an important type of poaching to talk about, but we shouldn't leave out things like the backdoor poachers, the poachers who do it because, it's on their property. They open the back door and they shoot it. Or the recreational poachers who are out, with their buddies. Maybe their buddy has a tag. They don't, but they have the opportunity. Again, opportunity comes into play a lot. and they take an animal that they didn't have a license or tag for. So, but I think one of the main things that we need to do is increase what we call guardianship. In criminological theory, that's very, very important. Guardianship, not only in terms of having more officers on the ground, if when possible, but also having people that witness it to being willing to report it. So knowing what has happened, knowing that it is an illegal take event and being willing to report it. So if we have people that are willing to report, we increase the risk of detection, which, may deter them from committing the crime to begin with.
And in our landowner and hunter survey, what we found is that, when they observed crimes in the wild, either illegal take or other wildlife crimes, they reported those at about 50%. So my question and, the follow-up potential research or education is, why not report 100% of them? If you're only reporting half of them, then we got work to do.
Right. That certainly feeds into that as a detection rate when people aren't willing to call it in or to let people know about it.
With the typologies, we lined out 9 distinct typologies. I won't go through all of them, but the one that kind of worries me the most, and we're seeing this more and more in the media these days, are the thrill kill poachers.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that are killing to basically intentionally cause stress and distress to the animal. They don't take the meat, they don't take any of the products, they want it to suffer. Those are your psychopaths. Those are the ones that turn into serial killers.
Yeah, that's certainly a problem for sure. Well, we also, part of the report, came up with a very, very robust list of best management practices. That's specific things that law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and obviously organizations like the Boone and Crockett Club and Wildlife Management Institute and our sponsors of this program will be able to carry forward to try to implement, to try to reduce that dark figure of poaching. I know the club is very interested in state legislative, because a couple of the things, one of the things, if I remember, that the prosecutor said is that changing it to a felony in certain cases, particularly when the value of that animal is significant or there are multiple animals in that creates a significant, once you become a felon, a convicted felon, it changes your ability to have a firearm or something along that line. So that obviously is, there's certain things from a legislative perspective, particularly working at the state legislative sportsmen's caucuses, might be something that the club and others are going to be working towards. They're also educating the prosecutors. As you said, there was a lot of them that were more interested in doing that. And I know we're talking about coming up with either an online or a face-to-face opportunity where we can teach them about poaching to help them understand the depth of the crime and the conservation cost, and create an opportunity for them to understand and have them also give us more information about what we can do. Reporting, tip lines, there's making that a little bit easier. Those were all things. What were some of the other things from your perspective that stood out as things that the public should know or be aware of?
Well, two things. One is that there is a tremendous difference, and we started off talking about this. There's a tremendous difference between regulated legal hunters and poachers. They are not the same thing, and we got to convince the public that they're not the same thing. Or in fact, they're the antithesis of hunters. But we also need to raise the awareness of the public in general about the value lost to them. What does it mean when people take animals off the landscape and that conservation value, not just the monetary part, but all the other things that it provides. People like clean air, they like clean water, they like healthy outdoors, healthy environment, healthy forest. By and large in this country, most of that is managed by hunters' dollars. And hunters' dollars in the form of licenses and permits. If you start losing those hunters' dollars because of rampant poaching, then you don't have clean air, you don't have clean water, you don't have healthy forest. So, the public needs to get more engaged in this. They're stealing from you. And if you let them steal your lawnmower, maybe you'll let them steal a deer. But if you call because they stole a $5 Amazon package off your front porch, why wouldn't you call if they stole a $5,000 elk from your backyard?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the things that we talked about in our press conference today is the social stigma, that there are a lot of people that are like, right on, brother. You got that. Who cares? Nobody. It's not worth anything. And that devalues wildlife. It also devalues or undermines legal, fair chase, ethical hunter, regulated. People who follow the rules. it makes us look bad when these people are doing this. So creating a social stigma is important. And you have this a similar analogy here, right? Like that, what is it, 40, 50 years ago, drunk driving was not necessarily looked at in the same light. It was kind of like hey, yeah.
Do we have to acknowledge it's that far back? This sort of dates us a little bit. Let's say 20 years ago.
But even domestic violence.
Back in the day was
Everybody looked the other way.
Yeah. I ran into bed. So look how much that's changed.
Exactly. And we still have people who are willing to do those things, but in the public's eye, it is not an okay crime. So creating a stigma, an educational campaign that allows us to say, no, we're not doing this anymore. And that is something for sure that the club and our partners are going to be trying to figure out a way to build build the hunting community's disdain for poachers, their willingness to stand up and say, no, we will not accept this anymore.
And getting back to the educational component as far as prosecutors or even the public is, I would argue, and we didn't ask this question, we phrased it a different way, but if you ask them just straight up, should illegal take of wildlife be a felony? Whether it's a member of the public, a prosecutor, a judge, or whatever, most of them would probably say gut reaction is no. I mean, dogfighting in this country in many states is still not a felony, and that's, intentionally harming other animals. So it's really hard to get harm against an animal to that level. When you tell them that the value of that animal is $5,000 and felony theft in that state is $1,000 triggers a felony theft, then it swings the other way. They said, well, of course it should be a felony. That's public property. It's 5 times the value of a felony theft charge. Yes, it should be a felony. So putting it into context, I think, is an important part.
That's interesting. So what was the biggest takeaway or what was the biggest surprise that you had from this research?
You go first.
I had a lot of surprises. I was surprised at the amount, of the dollar amount. I felt, we both had talked and we had talked with the club and some other folks about, we know this is a huge problem. Because they take place in remote places where there's not a lot of people, in many cases, and Aldo Leopold and others said, it's really the only activity you do where you judge yourself on your own merit. You're either ethical or you're not. Nobody's there to watch you to tell you if you are. It's not a spectator sport. But the dollar amount lost to conservation when it equals the total amount of all the licenses sold in a year's basis. When it equals the amount of federal assistance, federal grant money that agencies get. I mean, those are that's the 2 largest funding sources for state fish and wildlife agencies. And this is bigger than those.
Yeah, and both of those are hunter paid, yes. Right? I mean, so the federal Wildlife Restoration Fund, that's the excise taxes on firearms and ammunition and archery equipment, and the other is obviously what hunters pay when they pay for a license. So it's stealing from us directly as hunters. It's stealing from the public because wildlife is a public resource, has value to the entirety of the population.
One of the things that surprised me was, a lot of times when you talk to people about who have witnessed or know about poaching events and did not report it, they say, well, they needed to feed their family. But when we surveyed the officers said that, while that happens, it's not in very many of the cases. As a matter of fact, it was in the lowest percentage of the cases that they had investigated personally. They said that, even though they may say that and try to give that as an excuse, that's not what they're doing. And that, assistance programs to help provide food to their families are readily available in most areas. And signing up for those programs and getting involved with those is much easier, quite honestly, than going out and illegally taking an animal, going out and hunting it on your own. So these officers said no. They may, be saying that, but that's just not true in most of these cases, and we know firsthand. So for all of the people that are saying, I didn't report it because they're just trying to feed their family, apparently there's not that much of that going on. So report it, report it.
So there's we've all processed game before, big game before. We know it's a job. When you pull the trigger, the work just starts.
Absolutely.
So if you need meat, almost every state has some form of Hunters for the Hungry program. So would you rather have to go take a chance on getting caught, maybe losing your equipment, maybe getting a fine, and then doing all the work to process that meat when you can just go to a local Hunters for the Hungry outlet or food bank or whatever, and it's already processed for you and it's free. Just go pick it up. It's already in the packages,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to do that one rather than this one. This is a lot more work over here, and I might get caught and lose some other privileges. But I can go do this, and it's perfectly legal, and it's easier. So, and I think that's changed. Past 20 years ago, we didn't have those programs, and now we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you guys taking the time to get a little bit more information. All of the research, the full, and it's a 200-page with appendices research. There is a lot of data to pour through. We've summarized that. We had major findings. We have the best management practices pulled out. It's all available on the Boone and Crockett Club's website. That's boone-crockett.org. And we have a Poach and Pay section of the site. It's all going to be up there that people can get to. And we're hoping that this will get some big visibility, that'll hit people outside and understand. For one, to defend hunters, legal, ethical hunters, we need to stand up. We need to show that we're honest, that we don't want to tolerate this anymore because it's affecting all of us. It's affecting people's opinion of hunting in general. And it's affecting all of us from a financial perspective, but it's also from a ethics and a who we are, our heart. So hopefully this information will get out. We hope a lot of people will listen and share this podcast, get that information out, share the website. But there's going to be a lot. This is just the start. We've been really focused on getting the report done, which I know was a heavy lift for you guys. You guys spent a long time, 5 years on that research. And now it's out. The cryptic crime, the detection rate and the conservation costs are now public information. Help us share it. And help us be part of the solution.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Jon, Kristie, thank you guys so much for being on the Heritage of the Hunt podcast. We appreciate all the work that you've done. And until next time, this is Jody Stemler.
Thanks for having us.